Hey y'all, just thinking about this submarine. As quite a few folks have been doing, and as with it's about everything in my life, I think. How does this relate to my art, to my principles, to my teachings, to my philosophy? And I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and I didn't really have the forum to share my thoughts. It didn't really come up in classes, and I didn't want to feel like I was sharing these thoughts, when people are on an active search and rescue. And I didn't want to I didn't want to become this static where somebody more qualified than myself would be trying to get their information out. But something that we talk about in martial arts quite a bit, and sometimes we're overly reliant on the phrase, and sometimes we're overly reliant on the practice, is pressure testing, which of course is something that you're going to be doing. I just had this bottle of lemonade, but doing something to, in this case, testing the compressivity of the structure. And I thought, well, that's an easy thing. I have a lot I might say on pressure testing. But a couple of things that we might not be aware of, and this is kind of drawing the analogy from how a hull might be built. Perhaps an airplane or a submarine or something. And that is that the engineers, the testing engineers, I guess, test the strength, looking for deformities and possibly microscopic or certainly macroscopic, but microscopic damage from the test, which can point to either a materials issue or a design issue or a build issue. So we have like the materials, we have the processes by which they are built, and then we have the design of the overall design, how things, the architecture, if you like. Of course, we could also test the test and say, well, the reason that this failed is that this test was run poorly or incorrectly or incompletely, or it was the wrong test or something. And so, we pressure test ourselves in martial arts often by doing things like sparring, or doing techniques blindfolded, or doing them against a resisting partner or something like that. But when these things are tested, like a hull or something, or maybe a spaceship or whatever, they're tested, the once, but then they're also tested on their cycles, right? So the submarine is going to experience a lot of external stress, and then that's relieved when it surfaces again. And then it experiences a lot of external stress, and then when it surfaces again, that stress is released. So there's a cycle of stress, compressiveness, and then release, compress, release. Airplane will experience stresses as well, right? Where it goes from higher pressure outside it to lower pressure outside it, or higher pressure inside it. As the pressure descends or lowers in the body of the aircraft, they add pressure, but not as much as would have been there at sea level. So these changes happen. And of course, as that pressure changes, then there's different thermal properties that change. And I'm sure a whole bunch of other things that I'm not thinking of at the moment, and certainly I'm no expert on. But a particular, let's say, airframe is going to say, well, we're interested in how many hours that it's had in service, right? So I don't know what it is. Every 5,000 hours, it gets a certain service, right? But we're also interested in the cycles of it. So it's every 5,000 hours, or whatever the number is, or every, let's say, 2,000 takeoff and landing cycles, whichever comes first. In your car, you might be familiar with, an oil change will be every, whatever it is, 12,000 miles, or 4 months, whichever comes first, right? Because it's going to go through cycles of temperature or dry and wet, whether or not you're driving it very much. And certainly driving it every much is going to put it through other stresses. So the pressure testing that we're doing in the martial arts is going to be that initial pressure testing, like what's the most it can hold, but how well or to what degree does it maintain that limit after X number of cycles, right? So how would we apply this in our martial arts training? I'm not here to answer that. That's what I do in class. We teach. I'm just offering the question. Now, we often think in the martial arts and of developing the ability to withstand pressure, but that pressure may come at an inopportune time, or it may be a multiplying factor arising when other factors are at play. So for example, when we're testing our new thing, probably everything's fine-tooth combed and double-checked, and are we all sure ready? And we had a bunch of meetings, and we used the boardroom for 3 months straight, and we looked at everything, and we sent it to an outside firm, and we developed a plan, and everything is ready to be tested, and we test it, and it passes or fails. But in real life, those pressure tests may come when things are not in our favor to be passing them. Right? You've just had somebody close to you die. You're nursing your bum shoulder. You're in a sour mood. You didn't have coffee today, etc. And those pressures come. So can you survive those pressures that we measured in our sort of, they've been rigorously established as our maximum? Can we survive them when the pressures come and they arrive at a time when they're one of many factors? Also, when we're pressure testing, do we pressure test to fail? There's a difference between running a test where we're testing the pressure and then we're testing to fail. And there are a number of different ways something can fail. And then we want to learn about survivorship bias. So that if we're looking at the failures from a test, we're learning the appropriate lessons. It isn't to say that there's no value in a test that doesn't test to fail, but that's one of the tests. Now, how do we test to fail in martial arts? Well, I wouldn't want to kill somebody or injure somebody. Right? I wouldn't want to leave any lasting psychological scars, so I need to develop tests which maybe allowed somebody to fail in a particular way, and maybe I need to apprise them of that type of failure ahead of time so it's not a surprise, and see if they're on board with the test at all. Maybe you'll decide you can't test to fail in the martial arts, but you can do other tests, and they can be rigorous, and they can be myriad. That may be just perfectly good enough. But the particular thing that I've been thinking about that I'd like to get to is, when we're talking about this submarine that imploded, so something failed somewhere, right? Human error, materials error, construction process error, let's say, right? Or design error, or some combination, right? It's important to understand the Swiss cheese model of failure. That'd be another video. And that is that if we were looking for an easy analog to available to the martial artist in relation to this accident, I guess, this failure of the pressure vessel. We might say, well, am I a pressure vessel or am I a pressure conduit? Well, it's very hard to increase the pressure in this vessel with the lid open. Much easier to increase the pressure in this now. Right? And of course, if I put this on the fire, I don't know what would fail first. If the glass would crack, or the metal cap would deform or pop off. Maybe the glass would melt, and I don't know. But it would fail somewhere given enough heat and time. And that failure could show us, well, there's a design error in the glass. Of course, we might not call it an error in terms of intended use of the glass. But it might have been the design was fine, but it actually wasn't followed very well in the process. Or it was followed well, but they didn't really use the same type of glass. It wasn't borosilicate or what have you. And it might have been that, hey, it's a human error. You're not supposed to put your lemonade thing on top of the hot coals and stand there with no safety glasses on, right? So if we're a conduit for pressure, or a vessel for pressure, a sealed vessel for pressure, there's quite a big difference. And a conduit for pressure can still fail and can still be dangerous. But a conduit for pressure, like a pipe in your house, is going to have a much harder time failing than, let's say, a hot water heater or something, where you have essentially a pressure vessel. In other words, do you have outlets? Right? Do you have a means by which that pressure doesn't build up? And so this kind of segues me into this idea that when we look for a ready analog in our training to this submarine disaster, we might kind of focus on external pressures, that my mother-in-law is now living with me and my retirement's coming up in 2 months, and I'm still annoyed by that person at work, and the government is ruining everything, the way I see it in politics or whatever. But we also have pressure inside, right? A vessel or conduit can explode, not implode. So what if we're doing all this pressure testing in martial arts, but we're failing to recognize that the pressure can be greater on the inside than on the outside? How do we test that? How do we become aware of that? How do we equally value that? Because if I have a vessel of whatever kind, I don't want it to implode and I don't want it to explode. I want it to manage the pressures, both internally and externally, in a way that it satisfies its role. What's your role? Well, I'm going to hazard a guess that it's to stay alive, be somewhat happy, find joy in life, pursue your pursuits. Something like that. But that internal pressure may not be seen. It may not be what you're studying. It may not be what you're testing for. And of course, after testing, we generally iterate and improve. So consider how you pressure test your art from the inside. What are the forces inside that threaten to break the seams or cause leak, right? Or at the very least, let what does come out of you come out at a more violent or dangerous or worrisome rate. Lastly, when we're thinking of this analogy of the thing that gets built and we run it through its cycles, and we might imagine that the basic hull or pressure vessel doesn't really get replaced. So let's say the engine in your car, a big giant block of aluminum or steel or whatever it is, has all these other parts and valves and wires and pumps, and all these things get replaced during the lifespan of the car. But the block itself doesn't get replaced. Like, that's just what it is, right? And we presume all that testing was done by the manufacturer, right? Or from consumer advocates and unaffiliated engineers and so forth, scientists, engineers, what have you. So the rebuilds of the basic structure don't happen, generally speaking, to draw out this analogy. But we are a structure that is continuously rebuilding, whether you want to participate in it or not. But I can grow. I can change my meditation habits, my sleeping habits, my exercise habits, my nutrition. I can get most anything repaired by the doctors and healthcare providers, right? So maybe there's not an awful lot in here that is analogous to that basic pressure vessel, like the engine of the car or the hull of the submarine or something. And so when we think about the absolute limit of the pressure test, or we think about the cycles that we go through, likely changing the point at which that vessel would fail through cycles. We can also know that this is a vessel that we continually rebuild. Maybe we don't exactly redesign it. Maybe we're kind of stuck with the design. By and large, that's probably the case. But it's continuously rebuilt through our discipline. So, just a few thoughts on pressure testing. There will be a test on this. Well, I'm not going to tell you when. It's just going to happen. And it's worth half your grade. Love.